December 24th, 1914, 7:30 p.m., the frozen trenches near Ypres, Belgium. Through the darkness and bitter cold, something impossible was beginning to happen. Along miles of the Western Front, where for months men had been killing each other with industrial efficiency, where the mud was mixed with blood and the air thick with the stench of death, tiny lights began to appear in the German trenches. Candles, Christmas trees. And then, drifting across no man's land, came a sound that made British soldiers stop and listen in disbelief. Singing. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. Silent Night, sung in German, carried across the cratered wasteland that separated two armies. British soldiers, huddled in their muddy trenches, rifles at the ready, prepared for another night of sporadic sniper fire and artillery barrages, instead found themselves listening to a Christmas carol sung by men who just hours before had been trying to kill them. And then something even more extraordinary happened. The British soldiers began to sing back. Silent night, holy night. Within hours, along significant stretches of the Western Front, the guns would fall silent. Enemies would meet in no man's land to shake hands, exchange gifts, play football, and share a brief moment of humanity in the midst of industrialized slaughter. It would become known as the Christmas Truce of 1914, a spontaneous outbreak of peace that military commanders on both sides tried to suppress, that governments denied was happening, and that has become one of the most powerful symbols of the human capacity for compassion, even in the darkest circumstances. But to understand how this miracle occurred, we must first understand the war that made it so extraordinary, and the men who for one brief moment chose peace over violence. The war that would be over by Christmas. When war broke out in August 1914 across Europe, millions of men rushed to enlist, swept up in waves of patriotic fervor and romantic notions of glory. In Britain, recruitment offices were overwhelmed. Young men lined up for hours, afraid the war would be over before they had a chance to fight. It'll all be over by Christmas, they told each other, grinning with excitement. A quick adventure, a chance to prove their courage, and then home to be celebrated as heroes. In Germany, the mood was identical. The Kaiser's troops marched toward France singing patriotic songs, flowers in their rifle barrels, confident of quick victory. Young German soldiers wrote letters home promising to be back for Christmas dinner. The French, defending their homeland from invasion, were equally certain. Their doctrine of offensive spirit, élan, would carry them to victory within months. Everyone was wrong. By December 1914, the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had instead devolved into a nightmare beyond anything anyone had imagined. The Western Front stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, a 450-mile scar of trenches barbed, wire, and death. The trenches themselves were hell, deep ditches dug into the earth reinforced with sandbags, timber, and whatever material soldiers could scavenge. In the British trenches, men stood on duckboards, wooden planks laid across the muddy bottom to keep from sinking into the mire. But the boards were never enough. After rain, the trenches became rivers of liquid mud that could swallow a man whole. Corporal John Ferguson of the 2nd Scots Guards wrote in his diary, "The mud is indescribable. It's not like ordinary mud. It's a thick, clinging substance that seems almost alive. I've seen men lose their boots to it, sucked right off their feet. Trying to walk through it is exhausting. Every step requires pulling your leg free, and all the while you're exposed to sniper fire. We've lost men who simply got stuck and couldn't get down before a German bullet found them. The trenches were infested with rats, huge creatures, bloated from feeding on corpses that would swarm over sleeping men and steal food from their packs. Private Frederick Holmes of the London Rifle Brigade described waking to find a rat sitting on his chest, staring at him with what he swore was malicious intelligence. Lice were universal. Every soldier had them, crawling through hair, under clothes, causing constant itching and spreading disease. Men would spend hours reading their shirts, picking lice from the seams and crushing them between their thumbnails, but it was futile. The lice always came back. Trenchfoot was endemic, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions that caused feet to swell, turn black, and in severe cases require amputation. Soldiers were ordered to change their socks regularly and rub whale oil on their feet, but with limited supplies and constant standing in water, trenchfoot claimed thousands of victims. And then there was the constant danger. Snipers watched for any careless movement above the parapet. Artillery shells arrived without warning, burying men alive or tearing them apart. Mortar rounds arced overhead to explode in the trenches. Machine gun fire swept no man's land, making any movement in daylight suicidal. Between the opposing trenches lay no man's land, the term itself borrowed from medieval land disputes, a wasteland of shell craters, barbed wire, and decomposing bodies. The dead lay where they fell, often for weeks or months because retrieving them meant certain death. The smell was overwhelming, a sickly sweet stench of decay that soldiers could never quite get used to. Private Harold Starton of the Essex Regiment wrote home, "I cannot describe the smell. It gets into your clothes, your hair, your food. You taste it with every meal. Sometimes I think I'll never be clean again, never smell anything but death." This was the reality for millions of men by December 1914. The romantic notions of war had died in the first months of combat. The men in the trenches, British, French, German, had seen their friends killed and maimed. They had experienced terror beyond anything civilian life had prepared them for. They were exhausted, traumatized, and disillusioned. And yet somehow, on Christmas 1914, many of these same men would find it in themselves to see their enemies as fellow human beings, to reach across the horror and briefly touch something like peace. The men in the trenches. To understand the Christmas Truce, we must understand the men who participated in it. These were not professional soldiers, for the most part. The pre-war regular armies had been decimated in the opening months of fighting. By December 1914, the trenches were filled with volunteers and conscripts, ordinary men from ordinary backgrounds who had been transformed by circumstances into soldiers. On the British side, there were shopkeepers and factory workers, clerks and farmhands, teachers and miners. Many were very young, 18, 19, 20 years old. Some had lied about their age to enlist, boys of 15 or 16, desperate to join the adventure before it ended. Private Albert Moran, just 17 years old when he enlisted in the London Regiment, found himself in the trenches near Plugsteert Wood in December 1914. Years later, he would recall, "I don't think I'd ever been more than 20 miles from my home in Bethnal Green before I joined up. Suddenly I'm in Belgium, in a trench full of mud and rats, being shot at by people I'd never met and had no quarrel with. It was terrifying, but you couldn't show fear. You had to be brave for your mates." The class system of Edwardian Britain was reflected in military structure. Officers were typically from upper-class backgrounds, educated at public schools, trained to lead. The enlisted men were working class, trained to obey. But the trenches had a way of breaking down some barriers. When shells were falling, a man's breeding mattered less than his courage and competence. The German soldiers facing them were remarkably similar. Despite propaganda that portrayed Germans as Huns, barbaric monsters bent on conquest, the reality was far more mundane. German infantrymen were conscripts doing their duty, missing their families, enduring the same miserable conditions as their British counterparts. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann of the 133rd Royal Saxon Regiment, positioned near Plugsteert, came from a middle-class Dresden family. He'd been studying to be a teacher when war broke out. Like millions of others, he'd enlisted from a sense of patriotic duty, expecting a short conflict. By December, after months of combat, he was simply trying to survive and get home. Lieutenant Kurt Zamisch of the 134th Saxons kept a diary throughout the war. His December 1914 entries reveal a man who was tired, homesick, and increasingly questioning the purpose of the war. "We sit in trenches filling with water, watching for enemies we cannot see, firing at shadows, losing men to random shells. For what? To gain a few yards of mud? To prove whose king has the bigger army? I think of my family in Leipzig, of Christmas at home, of everything I took for granted." What's crucial to understand is that by December 1914, many soldiers on both sides had developed a complicated relationship with their enemies. They hated them, yes, these were the men killing their friends, but they also, in a strange way, understood them. The British soldiers could see the German trenches, could sometimes hear conversations, could observe the daily routines that mirrored their own. Both sides were enduring the same misery, the same cold and wet and fear. Both were far from home, missing their families, longing for the war to end. This shared suffering created a strange sort of kinship, even as they continued trying to kill each other. Live and let live. Even before the Christmas Truce, an informal system of mutual tolerance had developed in some sectors of the front. Military historians call it live on and let live, unofficial arrangements where both sides tacitly agreed to minimize aggression during certain times or activities. For example, both sides needed to bring up supplies, repair trenches, and dispose of waste. These activities made men vulnerable. A tacit understanding developed. If the Germans didn't shoot during the British breakfast time, the British wouldn't shoot during German breakfast time. Morning stand to, when all troops manned the trenches at dawn and dusk, the most likely times for attack, would see both sides alert and ready. But once stand to ended and it was clear no attack was coming, an unofficial truce might settle over the sector. Private Frank Richards of the Royal Welch Fusiliers described the phenomenon. There was this understanding, see? We wouldn't shoot at them during certain times if they didn't shoot at us. Not that anyone ever discussed it officially. The officers pretended not to notice. But everyone knew. One morning, a German stood up on his parapet in broad daylight, bold as brass, and our lot didn't shoot. He was taking a piss, poor bastard. Couldn't very well shoot a man for that, could we? After he finished, he waved at us and got back down. We waved back. This wasn't universal. Some sectors saw constant, vicious fighting. The level of hostility varied depending on which units faced each other, recent casualties, and the personalities of local commanders. But in many quiet sectors, particularly where the same units faced each other for extended periods, a degree of accommodation developed. Snipers were hated by everyone because they disrupted these informal truces. A good sniper could make life miserable for an entire sector, killing men during supposedly quiet times, reigniting hostilities. Both sides tried to eliminate enemy snipers as priority targets. Artillery was different. Shells came from miles behind the lines, ordered by officers who couldn't see the targets, executed by men who never saw the results. It was impersonal, industrial, killing. But rifle and machine gun fire in the trenches was personal. You could see the men you were shooting at, and they could see you. This personal element made a difference. It's harder to kill someone you can see as a human being rather than an abstract enemy. The men in the trenches on both sides understood this implicitly. By December 1914, in many sectors, an uneasy equilibrium had developed. Not quite peace, but not quite total war either. The stage was set for something extraordinary to happen. The approach of Christmas. As December progressed and Christmas approached, the men in the trenches thought increasingly of home. Christmas was the most important family holiday in both British and German culture. For many soldiers, this would be their first Christmas away from home. Letters from home arrived with increasing frequency, many containing small Christmas gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, warm socks, letters from children. The contrast between the warmth and love expressed in these letters and the cold brutality of trench life was almost unbearable. Private George Eade of the 3rd Rifle Brigade received a letter from his 6-year-old daughter with a drawing of a Christmas tree and the words, "Come home soon, Daddy," printed in careful letters. He showed it to his mates, trying to laugh off the emotion, but everyone in the trench understood. They all had similar letters, similar longings. On the German side, packages from home began arriving, the Liebesgaben, love gifts, sent by families and charitable organizations. These often contained traditional Christmas items, candles, small Christmas trees, Tannenbaum, gingerbread, sausages, and tobacco. The German tradition of Christmas trees was not yet universal in Britain. The custom had been imported by Prince Albert in the Victorian era and was gaining popularity, but it was still primarily a German tradition. When German soldiers began setting up small Christmas trees in their trenches, decorating them with candles, it was something distinctly German, something that spoke of home and peace and everything the trenches were not. Both armies tried to maintain morale with promises of special Christmas rations. The British would receive plum pudding, the Germans extra beer and tobacco. Princess Mary, daughter of King George V, sponsored the creation of gift boxes for every British soldier at the front, brass boxes containing cigarettes, chocolate, and a Christmas card bearing her image. But these official gestures, while appreciated, couldn't mask the fundamental reality. The soldiers would be spending Christmas in frozen, muddy trenches, far from their families, surrounded by death. The weather in late December 1914 was brutally cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Rain and snow alternated, turning the trenches into icy rivers. Men stamped their feet and blew on their hands trying to maintain circulation. Sentries on duty risked frostbite. The suffering was universal, transcending national boundaries. On December 23rd, unusual activity began in the German trenches opposite the British lines near Ypres. British sentries reported seeing increased movement, hearing more noise than usual. Was this preparation for an attack? The British soldiers checked their rifles, made sure ammunition was accessible, prepared for the worst. But no attack came. Instead, as darkness fell, small lights began appearing along the German parapet. Candles. Christmas Eve, the singing begins. December 24, 1914 began like any other day on the Western Front. Morning stand to, breakfast of tea and bully beef, the usual routine of trench maintenance and guard duty. Light snow fell intermittently, dusting the sandbags and frozen mud with white. As evening approached, the British soldiers in the trenches near Plugsteret Wood, known to British troops as Plug Street, noticed something unusual. The German trenches, usually dark and menacing, were being decorated with small Christmas trees, their branches adorned with candles. Corporal John Ferguson of the Scots Guards watched through a periscope as Germans carefully set up the trees along their parapet. "They're mad," one of his mates said. "Those candles will make them perfect targets." But the British didn't shoot. Something about the sight of Christmas trees in a war zone seemed to demand a response other than violence. As full darkness fell around 7:30 p.m., more and more candles appeared in the German trenches. The line of lights stretched for hundreds of yards, small flames flickering in the cold night air. It was beautiful and surreal, a vision of Christmas in the midst of hell. And then the singing began. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann of the 133rd Royal Saxon Regiment would later write about this moment in his diary. The men started spontaneously. No one ordered it. Someone began singing Stille Nacht, and others joined in. Soon the entire company was singing. It felt like being in church back home in Dresden. For a few minutes, we forgot about the war, forgot about the cold and the mud and the fear. We were just German men singing a German Christmas carol. The sound carried clearly across no man's land. In the British trenches, men stopped what they were doing and listened. Silent Night was known in Britain, though not as universally beloved as in Germany. Some of the British soldiers recognized it immediately. Others just knew it was a Christmas carol, sung with obvious emotion by men who, hours before, had been enemies. Private Albert Morin, listening from his position in the London Regiment trenches, later recalled, "It was the strangest thing. Here were these Germans, singing, and the song was so beautiful and so sad. You could hear the longing in their voices, the homesickness, and you realized they were just like us. They wanted to be home for Christmas too." When the Germans finished Stille Nacht, there was a moment of silence. Then, from the British trenches, someone started singing The First Knoll. Others joined in, and soon the British lines echoed with their own Christmas carol. The Germans listened. Then they applauded. Back and forth it went, caroling across no man's land. The Germans sang, O Tannenbaum. The British responded with, O come all ye faithful. Each side listened respectfully to the other, then applauded. At some point, accounts differ on exactly when, Germans began shouting across no man's land in English. Many German soldiers spoke some English, having worked in Britain before the war or studied it in school. "English soldier, Happy Christmas! We no shoot, you no shoot," the British soldiers shouted back. "Merry Christmas, Fritz!" Someone on the British side yelled, "Come over here, Jerry!" Someone on the German side shouted back, "You come here!" There was laughter from both trenches. The tension that had defined every moment for months was beginning to dissolve, replaced by something none of them had expected: genuine friendliness. In some sectors, the fraternization went further that night. German soldiers climbed out of their trenches and stood on the parapet, visible in the candlelight, arms raised to show they held no weapons. When British soldiers didn't shoot, some Germans walked forward into no man's land. Tentatively, incredibly, some British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and met them. They shook hands, these men who had been trying to kill each other. They exchanged small gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, buttons from uniforms as souvenirs. They showed each other photographs of wives, girlfriends, children, families. Lieutenant Geoffrey Heinecke of the 2nd Queen's Westminster Rifles wrote in a letter home, "I met a German officer in no man's land. He spoke perfect English. Had been a waiter in London before the war. We talked about the weather, about how awful the trenches were, about how we both wanted to be home. It was the most surreal conversation of my life. Here was a man I might have killed yesterday or might kill tomorrow, and we were chatting like we'd met at a pub." Not everyone participated. Some British and German soldiers remained in their trenches, suspicious or unwilling to fraternize with the enemy. Some officers tried to stop it, ordering their men to return to their positions. But the momentum was building, and orders were increasingly ignored. As midnight approached, Christmas Day, the sound of singing filled the night all along significant stretches of the Western Front. Silent Night, in particular, became the unofficial anthem of the truce, sung in German and English simultaneously, the two languages blending in the cold air. Private Frederick Heath of the 1st Battalion, Northumberland Fusiliers, wrote, "The Germans finished their carol, and we thought that we ought to retaliate in some way, so we sang the first Knoll, and when we finished that, they all began clapping, and then they struck up another favorite of theirs, O Tannenbaum." And so it went on. First, the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours, until when we started up, O Come All Ye Faithful, the Germans immediately joined in singing the same hymn to the Latin words, Adeste Fideles. And I thought, well, this is really a most extraordinary thing. Two nations both singing the same carol in the middle of a war. As Christmas Eve turned into Christmas Day, along miles of the Western Front, an unofficial truce had taken hold. The industrial slaughter had been suspended, replaced by a fragile, beautiful moment of shared humanity. Tomorrow would bring even more extraordinary scenes. Men who had been trained to kill each other would meet in no man's land in daylight, would talk and laugh and play games, would bury their dead together, and would create memories that would last their entire lives. For tonight, though, on Christmas Eve 1914, the guns were silent, carols filled the air, and for a brief moment, peace on earth was more than just words in a song. Christmas morning, into no man's land. December 25th, 1914 dawned cold and clear along much of the Western Front. A light frost covered the ground, making the blasted landscape sparkle in the weak winter sunlight. As dawn broke, men stirred in the trenches, emerging from fitful sleep to face another day of war. Except this day would be different. In many sectors, the fraternization that had begun on Christmas Eve continued and expanded on Christmas morning. What had started as singing and tentative meetings in the darkness became, in daylight, something even more remarkable. Along the British lines, soldiers woke to find German signs posted on the enemy parapets. You no shoot, we no shoot. Some were more elaborate, written in careful English. Merry Christmas. You don't fire, we won't fire. In other places, Germans simply stood up on their parapets in full view, making themselves visible targets to prove their peaceful intentions. When no shots came, they waved. British soldiers, after a moment of shocked disbelief, waved back. Then, just as on Christmas Eve, men began climbing out of the trenches and walking into no man's land. Captain Sir Edward Hulse of the Scots Guards watched in amazement as his men left the trenches without orders and walked toward the German lines. His instinct as an officer was to order them back, to maintain discipline and military order. But something made him hesitate. They weren't being reckless, Hulse later wrote in his diary. They were being human, and I realized I had no desire to stop them. I wanted to go too. So Captain Hulse climbed out of the trench and walked into no man's land to meet his German counterparts. All along the line, similar scenes unfolded. In some places, individual soldiers met halfway between the trenches. In others, entire groups gathered, British and German mixed together in the cratered landscape that had been a killing ground just yesterday. The meetings were awkward at first. These men spoke different languages, came from different cultures, and had been trained to see each other as the enemy. But they found ways to communicate. Broken English, hand gestures, shared smiles. Many German soldiers spoke English, having worked in Britain before the war. England and Germany had significant trade and cultural connections before 1914, and it wasn't unusual for young German men to spend time in Britain learning English and working in hotels, restaurants, and businesses. One British soldier met a German who had been a barber in Shoreditch, a working-class neighborhood in London. They talked about streets they both knew, pubs they'd both drunk in, the peculiarities of London life. The German asked if his old shop was still there. The British soldier didn't know, but promised to check if he got home leave. Another British soldier discovered that the German officer he was talking to had attended Oxford before the war, studying literature. They discussed Shakespeare. The German had written his thesis on Hamlet. Here, in a shell crater in Belgium, surrounded by barbed wire and mud, two men analyzed to be or not to be, while their fellow soldiers watched in bemusement. The most common activity was simple conversation and the exchange of small gifts. Soldiers showed each other photographs from home, shared whatever food or tobacco they had, and talked about their experiences of the war. German soldiers gave British soldiers cigars, beer, and buttons from their uniforms as souvenirs. British soldiers reciprocated with cigarettes, jam, and badges. Some exchanges were more personal. Addresses were written down, promises made to contact each other after the war. Private Cunningham of the 5th Scottish Rifles wrote home, "I got a cigar from a German soldier who said it was from his Christmas ration. He wanted one of our badges, so I gave him mine. He gave me his address in Bavaria and made me promise to visit after the war. I said I would, though God knows if either of us will survive to keep that promise." One of the most striking aspects of these meetings was the recognition of shared suffering. The Germans and British discovered they were enduring identical miseries: the cold, the mud, the lice, the rats, the fear, the homesickness. A German soldier showed his British counterpart his feet, swollen and discolored with trench foot. The British soldier showed his own, equally damaged. They laughed at the absurdity of it. Here they were, supposedly enemies, but their real enemy was the trench itself, the conditions that affected both sides equally. The dead between the lines. One of the most poignant aspects of the Christmas Truce was the burial of the dead. For months, bodies had been lying in no man's land, impossible to retrieve because any movement in the open brought immediate fire. Now, with an unofficial truce in place, both sides could finally recover and bury their fallen comrades. Working together, British and German soldiers located bodies, identified them when possible, and dug graves in the frozen ground. It was grim work, made worse by the state of decomposition, but it was also necessary closure. These men had been soldiers, comrades, friends. They deserved burial, not to lie forgotten in the mud. Chaplains from both sides conducted services. Lieutenant Kurt Zamisch of the 134th Saxons described one such burial. "We found 6 British soldiers who had fallen in November, lying in shell holes between the lines. We carried them back, and the British chaplain said prayers over them. Our chaplain said prayers too in German. The British soldiers stood at attention, saluting their dead. We did the same. It felt right, respectful. These men had died far from home. The least we could do was give them a proper burial." In some places, British and German dead were buried together in the same graves, a tangible symbol of their shared humanity. Crosses were made from scrap wood, names inscribed when known. Unknown soldiers marked simply "Ein Deutscher Soldat," or a British soldier. Captain Charles Stockwell of the Royal Welch Fusiliers wrote, "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be helping Germans bury their dead. But there we were, lowering a young German private into a grave while his comrades stood by. He couldn't have been more than 18. His fellows were crying openly. We all were, to be honest. War makes you hard, but not so hard you can't recognize another mother's son. The burial details gave soldiers from both sides a chance to see no man's land up close, to walk the ground that had previously meant death to cross. What they saw sobered them all. The devastation was complete. Shell craters overlapped, some so large you could hide a house in them. Barbed wire stretched in massive tangles, rusted and twisted. Unexploded shells jutted from the mud, still dangerous. And everywhere, the detritus of war, smashed equipment, shredded uniforms, shell casings, and the smell of death. This was what they'd been fighting over, this wasteland, these yards of ruined earth. Standing in no man's land, looking at the destruction, many soldiers on both sides began questioning the purpose of it all. Private Frank Richards of the Royal Welch Fusiliers summed up the sentiment. We looked at the ground we'd been fighting over, and it was nothing. Just mud and wire and death. Not worth a single life, let alone thousands, but orders are orders, and when the truce ended, we'd be back trying to kill each other over this same worthless ground. The football match. Perhaps the most famous element of the Christmas truce is the football match, or rather, matches, as there were several unofficial games played in different sectors on Christmas Day 1914. The story of British and German soldiers playing football in no man's land has taken on almost mythical status. And like most myths, the truth is somewhat more complicated and varied than the popular narrative suggests. Football, soccer to Americans, was hugely popular in both Britain and Germany before the war. Many soldiers on both sides had played the game as civilians. Footballs were sometimes included in supply packages sent from home, and soldiers occasionally kicked balls around behind the lines when out of the trenches. On Christmas Day 1914, in several sectors, soldiers produced footballs and proposed matches. The Germans were generally enthusiastic. They loved football and welcomed any distraction from trench life. The British, equally fond of the game, agreed. The pitch was no man's land itself. The goals were marked with caps or coats. The teams were mixed or divided by nationality, depending on the sector. The rules were informal at best, and the playing surface, frozen mud, shell craters, and barbed wire, was less than ideal. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann of the 183rd Royal Saxon Regiment described one such match. The English brought a football from their trench, and pretty soon a lively game ensued. How marvelously wonderful, yet how strange it was. The English officers felt the same way about it. Thus, Christmas, the celebration of love, managed to bring mortal enemies together as friends for a time. Private Ernie Williams of the 6th Cheshires participated in a game and later wrote, "The ball appeared from somewhere. I don't know where, but it came from their side. They made up some goals, and one fellow went in goal, and then it was just a general kickabout. I should think there were about a couple of hundred taking part. I had a go at the ball. I was pretty good then, at 19. Everybody seemed to be enjoying themselves. There was no sort of ill will between us." The quality of play was, by all accounts, poor. The ground made dribbling impossible. Players were wearing heavy boots and thick coats. Many were weak from poor diet and months of physical hardship. But quality didn't matter. What mattered was the moment, enemies playing a game together, laughing, having fun, being young men rather than soldiers. Not all the matches were organized games. In some sectors, it was just kicking a ball around, British and German soldiers taking turns, calling out encouragement in broken English and German. In others, it was more structured, with two sides and scorekeeping, though the scores recorded in various diaries and letters differ wildly and probably shouldn't be taken as historically accurate. One frequently cited account claims the Germans won 3-2. Another source says the British won 3-1. Yet another suggests it ended in a draw. The truth is, there were multiple games in multiple sectors with different outcomes. The score, ultimately, didn't matter. What mattered was the extraordinary image, men who had been trained to kill each other, playing football together on ground soaked with their comrades' blood. It was absurd and beautiful and deeply human. Captain Sir Edward Hulse watched one of these games and wrote to his mother, "One of the most curious things I've seen. The men were quite happy, the Germans laughing and laughing, and our fellows doing the same. Nobody seemed to remember there was a war on. But there was a war on, and not everyone was playing football, those who did not participate." It's important to understand that the Christmas truce was not universal. While it occurred along significant stretches of the Western Front, estimates suggest anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of the British line participated to some degree. There were also many sectors where fighting continued throughout Christmas. In some areas, recent casualties had created too much bitterness for fraternization. If a unit had lost men to a German raid the previous week, or if a popular officer had been killed by a sniper, the desire for revenge overrode any Christmas sentiment. The soldiers in these sectors kept their rifles ready and their hatred fresh. Lieutenant Cyril Drummond of the 135th Battery, Royal Field Artillery, whose position saw no truce, wrote bitterly, "While some fools were playing football with the Germans, we continued our duty. Men are dying every day in this war. This isn't a game. Those who fraternized with the enemy have forgotten why we're here, forgotten what the Germans have done to Belgium, forgotten their duty to king and country." This perspective was particularly common among artillery units, which operated miles behind the front lines and never saw the enemy as human beings, only as map coordinates and targets. Artillery officers tended to view the truce as a dangerous breakdown in military discipline. Some infantry officers also disapproved strongly. Major General Smith Dorrien, commanding 2 Corps, issued orders stating, "Friendly intercourse with the enemy is not to be allowed." He threatened disciplinary action against officers who permitted fraternization. But many officers on the ground found themselves in an impossible position. How could they order men back into trenches when those same men were currently shaking hands with Germans in no man's land? How could they punish soldiers for showing humanity? Some officers chose to quietly ignore what was happening, turning a blind eye to activities they couldn't officially condone but couldn't bring themselves to stop. Others participated themselves, reasoning that maintaining rapport with their men was more important than following orders from officers safely behind the lines who didn't understand the reality of trench warfare. Captain J.C. Dunn, medical officer of the 2nd Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers, noted the class dynamics at play. The staff officers and generals were horrified by the truce, but they weren't in the trenches. They weren't the ones doing the dying. The men who were actually facing the Germans every day understood something the brass didn't, that the enemy soldiers were just men like them, caught in the same nightmare, wanting the same thing, to survive and go home. There was also variation in participation based on which German units were opposite British lines. The truce seems to have been most common in sectors where Saxon or Bavarian units faced the British. These southern German units had a reputation for being less militaristic than Prussian units, more willing to engage in live and let live arrangements. Where Prussian units held the line, particularly elite guards regiments or units that had recently arrived from the Eastern Front, truces were less common. These units maintained strict discipline and were less inclined toward fraternization. The French sectors of the line saw much less fraternization than the British sectors. France had been invaded. German troops occupied significant portions of French territory, and French civilians were suffering under German occupation. French soldiers found it harder to see Germans as anything but invaders who needed to be driven from French soil. There were some instances of French-German fraternization, but they were far less common and extensive than the British-German truces. French military authorities also cracked down harder on any fraternization, viewing it as a more serious breach of discipline. The Belgian sections of the front, where Belgian units held the line, saw virtually no fraternization. Belgium had been devastated by the German invasion, cities destroyed, civilians massacred, the entire country occupied except for a tiny sliver in the west. Belgian soldiers had no interest in Christmas truces with the men who had destroyed their homeland. So while the Christmas truce is remembered as a widespread phenomenon, the reality was more complex. It occurred in specific places under specific conditions, involving specific units. It was extraordinary, but not universal. Christmas Day continues. As Christmas Day, 1914 progressed, the fraternization continued and evolved. What had started as singing on Christmas Eve expanded to meetings in no man's land on Christmas morning, continued throughout the day as soldiers from both sides took advantage of this unprecedented opportunity. Some soldiers used the truce to improve their living conditions. With no risk of being shot, they could repair and reinforce their trenches in daylight. They could drain waterlogged sections, replace damaged duckboards, and strengthen parapets. Both sides worked on their defenses, sometimes within sight of each other, occasionally calling out friendly comments. "You fellows need more sandbags over there," a British soldier shouted to Germans working on their trench. "Mind your own business, Tommy," came the laughing reply. Others used the time to explore. Soldiers who had been confined to trenches for weeks or months took the opportunity to walk around, to see the landscape, to get a sense of the larger geography of the battlefield. Some climbed to higher ground for better views, something that would have been suicidal any other day. Lieutenant Bruce Bairnsfather, a British officer and later a famous cartoonist, walked through no man's land examining the German defenses with professional interest. Their trenches were remarkably well built, much better than ours in many respects. They had wooden benches, better drainage, more organized layouts. I found myself both impressed and a bit envious. Our fellows were living in worse conditions than our enemies, which seemed rather unfair. Entrepreneurial soldiers on both sides engaged in trading. Germans wanted British cigarettes and jam. British soldiers wanted German sausages and beer. Impromptu markets sprang up in no man's land, with soldiers bargaining good-naturedly over exchange rates. 2 cigarettes for a sausage? You're mad. 1 cigarette, and that's generous. The sausage is bigger than the cigarette. The cigarette is English tobacco worth 3 of your sausages. Private Frank Richards participated in this trading and came away with German beer, cigars, and a button from a German uniform. He gave away his cigarette ration, some plum jam, and a cap badge. "I got the better deal," he wrote in his memoirs. "German beer was much better than our rum ration." Some soldiers exchanged addresses, promising to write after the war. Others exchanged small personal items as mementos, photographs, coins, religious medals. These exchanges were deeply symbolic, representing a hope that the men might survive the war and maintain some connection to this extraordinary moment. Private Albert Morin received a photograph of a German soldier's family, his wife and 2 small children. The German, who spoke broken English, explained that he was a carpenter from Bavaria, that his children were 4 and 6 years old, that he hadn't seen them in 5 months. Morin showed the German a photograph of his own family in London, his mother and father, his 3 younger siblings. The German studied the photo carefully, then said, "Your family misses you, like mine misses me. This war is bad for families." It was a simple observation, but it struck Morin deeply. He was right, Morin later recalled. The war was bad for families. His family, my family, families all over Europe. We were all suffering. And for what? The officers' experience. While enlisted men were playing football and trading cigarettes, officers on both sides were having their own, somewhat different experience of the truce. Military protocol required that officers maintain dignity and formality, even in these extraordinary circumstances. When British and German officers met in no man's land, there was an elaborate dance of politeness, each side trying to demonstrate that they were civilized gentlemen, not barbarians. German officers often spoke excellent English, having been educated in military academies where English was taught as part of the curriculum. Many came from aristocratic backgrounds and saw themselves as part of an international officer class that transcended national boundaries. Before the war, British and German officers had attended the same social events, knew each other through family connections, and shared similar worldviews. The war had made them enemies, but it hadn't completely erased these connections. Captain Sir Edward Hulse of the Scots Guards met with several German officers on Christmas Day. His letters home describe elaborate conversations about military tactics, pre-war travels, and mutual acquaintances. I met a German captain who had been stationed in Berlin before the war. He knew several British officers I'd met during my own time in Germany. We discussed the fighting, each complimenting the other side's courage and effectiveness. It was very civilized, very proper. We both knew that tomorrow we'd be trying to kill each other's men, but for today, we could be professional colleagues. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann had a similar experience. The British officers were perfect gentlemen. We discussed the war, carefully avoiding any criticism of our respective governments or high commands, and found that we had much in common. We were all professional soldiers, doing our duty, hoping to survive with honor. The British captain I spoke with had fought in the Boer War. I asked about his experiences there, and he was quite candid about the difficulties of that campaign. Some officers used the opportunity to gather intelligence. Under the guise of friendly conversation, they observed German positions, noted the condition of enemy soldiers, assessed morale and readiness. The Germans did the same, their trained eyes picking up details even while chatting pleasantly about Christmas traditions. This intelligence gathering was a delicate business, too obvious, and it would be seen as a betrayal of the truce's spirit. But it would have been negligent not to observe what could be observed. The war would continue, after all, and information might save lives. The officer meetings also involved the practical matter of managing the truce itself. How long would it last? What activities were acceptable? What should happen when it ended? Some officers made explicit agreements. The truce would end at midnight, or at dawn the next morning, or when one side fired 3 shots in the air as a signal. Others left it vague, preferring not to put an official end time on something that was officially not happening. Lieutenant Kurt Zamisch recorded one such conversation in his diary. The British lieutenant asked how we would signal when the truce was over. I suggested firing 3 shots straight up at midnight. He agreed, and we shook hands on it. It felt very businesslike, scheduling the resumption of warfare. But it was better than someone getting shot because they didn't realize the truce had ended. The reality behind the romance. It's important not to romanticize the Christmas truce beyond what actually occurred. Popular imagination has turned it into a story of universal peace and brotherhood, but the reality was more complicated and in many ways more interesting. The fraternization didn't mean soldiers suddenly stopped seeing each other as enemies. Most men who participated in the truce remained committed to winning the war. They didn't question their duty or desert their posts. They simply found a way to be human beings for a few hours while remaining soldiers. Private Cunningham of the 5th Scottish Rifles captured this duality in a letter home. I spent Christmas afternoon talking with a German fellow about his family, his home, his job before the war. He was a decent sort, no different from our boys, really. But I know when the truce ends, he'll be trying to kill me and I'll be trying to kill him. That's just how it is. The truce doesn't change that. It just gives us a brief moment to remember we're human before we go back to the business of war. Some soldiers found the cognitive dissonance deeply disturbing. How could you share cigarettes and laughter with someone on Christmas, then try to kill them on Boxing Day? The contradiction was almost unbearable. Lance Corporal William Quinton wrote, "I can't reconcile it in my mind. Yesterday I was showing Fritz pictures of my girl back home. Today I'm supposed to shoot him if he shows his head above the parapet. It makes you wonder about the whole thing, about what we're really fighting for." This questioning was exactly what military authorities feared most. Soldiers who saw enemies as human beings might hesitate to kill them. Soldiers who questioned the purpose of the war might refuse to fight. The Christmas truce, from the perspective of generals and politicians, was dangerous precisely because it might make men think too much. There was also darker behavior during the truce that gets less attention in popular accounts. Some soldiers used the opportunity to spy on enemy positions, deliberately gathering intelligence while pretending to fraternize. Others reinforced their defenses while the enemy was distracted with Christmas celebrations. In at least one recorded instance, a British sniper used the truce to identify specific German officers and mark their positions, planning to target them when fighting resumed. When a fellow soldier accused him of violating the truce's spirit, the sniper replied coldly, "We're here to win a war, not make friends. I'll use every advantage I can get." Such behavior was rare, but it existed. Not every soldier was overcome with Christmas spirit. Some remained focused on the mission, viewing the truce as weakness, or at best, a temporary tactical pause. The German perspective. Understanding the German experience of the Christmas truce provides important context. For German soldiers, the situation by December 1914 was complicated. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, had called for a quick victory over France, knocking them out of the war before turning to deal with Russia. The plan had failed. The German advance had been stopped at the Marne in September 1914, and the Western Front had solidified into trench warfare. German troops occupied significant portions of Belgium and France, but they were far from home, facing enemies on two fronts, Russia in the east, Britain and France in the west, and increasingly aware that the quick victory they'd been promised wasn't materializing. German soldiers were also dealing with propaganda from home that painted the war in increasingly mythological terms. They were defending the fatherland, protecting German culture, resisting the encirclement by jealous enemies. But in the trenches, facing British soldiers who seemed remarkably similar to themselves, such propaganda rang hollow. Lieutenant Kurt Zamisch's diary entries from Christmas 1914 reveal a man struggling with these contradictions. We are told the English are degenerate, weak, not true soldiers, but I have seen them fight, and they are brave men, well-trained, determined. We are told the war is glorious, but there is no glory in the trenches, only mud and death. We are told victory is near, but we have been here for months with no end in sight. For many German soldiers, Christmas was even more emotionally significant than for the British. The German Christmas tradition, Weihnachten, was deeply ingrained in culture and family life. The Christmas tree, the carols, the family gatherings, the religious significance, all of this meant that being away from home at Christmas was particularly painful. The small Christmas trees that German soldiers set up in the trenches weren't just decorations. They were tangible connections to home, to family, to everything the war had taken from them. When German soldiers lit candles on those trees and sang Stille Nacht, they were expressing homesickness and longing that transcended military discipline. When British soldiers responded with their own carols, the Germans felt recognized. These enemies understood. They were also far from home, also missing their families, also enduring the same miserable conditions. This mutual recognition made fraternization possible. It wasn't that Germans suddenly decided British soldiers weren't enemies. It was that they recognized British soldiers as fellow sufferers in a war neither side seemed able to end. Private Rudolf Binding, a German soldier near Ypres, wrote, "When the English sang their carols, we understood. Not the words, I don't speak English, but the feeling behind them. The longing for home, for peace, for this nightmare to end. We felt the same. So when they climbed out of their trenches, we climbed out of ours. What else could we do? We are not animals, we are men, and even in war, men need moments of humanity." Christmas night. As Christmas Day 1914 drew to a close and darkness fell, the question on everyone's mind was, what happens now? In some sectors, soldiers returned to their trenches as evening approached, the fraternization ending naturally as daylight faded. Friendly goodbyes were exchanged, promises made to continue the truce through the night, and men climbed back into their muddy holes to resume their uncomfortable vigil. In other sectors, the fraternization continued after dark. Soldiers met in no man's land by lamplight, continuing conversations begun during the day. Some groups sang carols together, British and German voices blending in the darkness, just as they had on Christmas Eve. The question of how long the truce would last was addressed differently in different sectors. Some British and German officers had agreed on specific end times. Others left it open-ended, preferring to see how things developed. Captain Sir Edward Hulse recorded a conversation with a German officer about this very issue. I asked how long he thought this could last. He said, quite honestly, that it couldn't last long. Our high commands would order us to resume fighting, but perhaps we could enjoy one more day. I said that seemed reasonable, though I had no authority to agree to anything. We shook hands and agreed to see what tomorrow brought. In practice, the truce extended beyond Christmas Day in many sectors. Boxing Day, December 26th, saw continued fraternization in some areas, though less extensive than on Christmas itself. The extraordinary had become merely unusual, the impossible had become improbable. Some soldiers began to feel uncomfortable with the extended truce. The cognitive dissonance of being friendly with enemies became harder to maintain over multiple days. The sense that they were violating their duty, betraying their comrades who had died, grew stronger. Private George Ashurst of the Lancashire Fusiliers expressed this internal conflict. On Christmas Day, it felt right, natural. A day of peace seemed appropriate, but by Boxing Day, I was starting to feel guilty. We'd lost mates to German fire, good men, friends, and here I was chatting with the same people who'd killed them. It didn't feel right anymore. Military authorities on both sides were increasingly alarmed by reports of the truce. Orders came down from higher headquarters. Resume hostilities immediately. Officers were reminded of their duty. Threats of court-martial were made. Brigadier General G.T. Forstier Walker wrote to his division, "This fraternization with the enemy is disgraceful and must stop immediately. Officers allowing or participating in such activities will be held responsible. The enemy is to be engaged with vigor. There will be no repeat of this shameful episode." German High Command issued similar orders, particularly harsh in tone. Prussian military discipline had no tolerance for fraternization with the enemy. Officers who had allowed or participated in the truce faced official reprimands. But enforcing these orders was difficult. How do you punish thousands of soldiers for an act that, however unauthorized, was fundamentally decent? How do you court-martial officers for showing humanity? In practice, most authorities chose to issue strong warnings, but take no actual disciplinary action. The message was clear. This could never happen again. But no one would be punished for this first occurrence. The end of the truce. The Christmas truce ended not with a dramatic moment, but with a gradual, reluctant return to warfare. In most sectors, it simply faded away over December 26th and 27th, as soldiers on both sides acknowledged that the pause couldn't continue indefinitely. In some places, there were formal signals. 3 shots fired straight up, as agreed. A German officer standing on his parapet and shouting across no man's land, "We begin again at noon! Take cover!" The British shouting back acknowledgement. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann described the end of the truce in his sector. On December 27th, around 10 a.m., a German officer appeared on our parapet and called across to the British, "We must begin again at noon. Our generals are angry." The British called back, "We understand. Thank you for the warning." At noon exactly, a German machine gun fired a burst straight up into the air. The British did the same, and then we went back to war. The resumption of hostilities was, in most places, tentative and half-hearted. Soldiers who had been sharing cigarettes 2 days ago now fired rifles at each other, but often deliberately aiming high, not really trying to kill. Snipers, who had been the most hated men on both sides because they disrupted the live and let live arrangements, remained inactive. Artillery resumed first because artillery crews hadn't participated in the truce and had no personal connection with enemy soldiers. Shells began falling on both sides' positions, impersonal and indiscriminate. Gradually, over the following days, the war returned to normal, if normal is the right word for the industrialized slaughter of trench warfare. Snipers resumed their deadly work. Patrols ventured into no man's land at night. Men died for yards of muddy ground. But something had changed, subtly and permanently. The men who had participated in the Christmas truce carried the memory with them. They had seen the enemy as human beings, had shared moments of laughter and humanity, and they could never quite forget that. Private Albert Morin summed up the lasting impact. After Christmas 1914, I could never hate Germans the way I was supposed to. I had met them, talked with them, seen their photographs of wives and children. When I fired my rifle, I knew I might be killing someone like that German carpenter who'd shown me his family photo. It made it harder, in a way, but it also made me more determined to survive, to get home, to make sure his sacrifice and mine weren't for nothing. Why did it happen? Looking back at the Christmas truce more than a century later, historians have tried to understand why it happened. What circumstances allowed this spontaneous outbreak of peace in the midst of total war? Several factors came together to make the truce possible. First, timing. By December 1914, the initial enthusiasm for war had faded, but the deep bitterness of prolonged conflict hadn't fully set in. Soldiers had been in the trenches long enough to be exhausted and disillusioned, but not so long that hatred had become entrenched. Later in the war, after years of slaughter, after poison gas and massive offensives that gained nothing but casualties, such fraternization would become much less likely. Second, the specific units involved. The Christmas Truce was most common in sectors where Saxon or Bavarian units faced British troops. These southern German units had a reputation for being less militaristic, more willing to engage in informal truces. Where Prussian units held the line, fraternization was much rarer. Third, the absence of recent major offensives. In sectors where there had been large attacks or heavy casualties in the weeks before Christmas, bitterness made fraternization unlikely. But in relatively quiet sectors, where live and let live arrangements had already developed, the Christmas truce was a natural extension of existing practices. Fourth, the weather. The cold, muddy, miserable conditions affected both sides equally. This shared suffering created a sense of common experience that transcended national boundaries. When German and British soldiers looked at each other, they saw men enduring the same hardships, not abstract enemies. Fifth, Christmas itself. The holiday's emphasis on peace, goodwill, and family struck a powerful chord with men who were far from home, missing their families, longing for peace. The religious and cultural significance of Christmas provided a framework and justification for laying down arms. Sixth, the nature of trench warfare. The trenches were close enough that soldiers could see and hear each other. They weren't abstract enemies. They were real people, visible and audible. This proximity made it harder to dehumanize the enemy, made it easier to see them as fellow humans. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Christmas truce happened because the men in the trenches wanted it to happen. They were tired of killing and dying. They wanted for just a moment to be human beings rather than soldiers. The truce was a bottom-up phenomenon, initiated by enlisted men, often over the objections of their officers, driven by a fundamental human need for connection and peace. Professor Stanley Weintraub, historian and author of Silent Night, the story of the World War I Christmas truce, argues, the Christmas truce occurred because the men fighting the war were still able, in 1914, to see themselves as individuals with agency, not just cogs in a military machine. Later in the war, after the mass slaughters of the Somme and Verdun, after the introduction of poison gas and the increasing mechanization of warfare, such individual initiative became almost impossible. The soldiers became genuinely brutalized, hatred became real, and the idea of fraternizing with the enemy became unthinkable. But in December 1914, there was still space for humanity, and the soldiers seized that space. The reaction at home, news of the Christmas truce, reached Britain gradually, through letters from soldiers to their families. At first, many recipients thought their sons or husbands were exaggerating or joking. Playing football with Germans? Impossible. But as more and more letters arrived telling similar stories, newspapers began to take notice. The first reports appeared in British papers on December 31, 1914, and in the first days of January 1915. Public reaction was mixed. Some saw the truce as a beautiful expression of Christmas spirit and humanity. Others viewed it as a dangerous dereliction of duty that undermined the war effort. The Times of London published an editorial that captured this ambivalence. The fraternization between British and German soldiers at Christmas, while touching in its demonstration of common humanity, raises serious questions about military discipline and the resolve of our forces. We are engaged in a war for civilization itself. Sentiment, however natural, cannot be allowed to interfere with the prosecution of this war to a victorious conclusion. Religious leaders generally praised the truce. The Archbishop of Canterbury called it a ray of light in the darkness, a reminder that even in the midst of war, the Christian message of peace and goodwill has power. Sermons across Britain referenced the truce as evidence of humanity's essential goodness. But political and military leaders were alarmed. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith privately expressed concern that such fraternization might undermine public support for the war. How could the government ask families to sacrifice their sons if those sons were playing football with the enemy? Military authorities issued statements downplaying the extent of the truce, claiming it had been limited and isolated, certainly not a widespread phenomenon. They emphasized that the truce had been unauthorized and would not be tolerated in the future. In Germany, the reaction was similar. Some newspapers celebrated the truce as evidence of German soldiers' humanity and Christmas devotion. Others condemned it as weakness unworthy of German military tradition. The German High Command was particularly harsh in its condemnation. General Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, issued orders making clear that any future fraternization would be severely punished. The Prussian military tradition had no room for sentiment. In France, where news of the truce was slower to arrive and less widely reported, the reaction was more uniformly negative. With German troops occupying French territory, with French civilians suffering under occupation, there was little sympathy for stories of French or British soldiers fraternizing with the invaders. The soldiers' own reflections. In letters and diaries written during and after the war, soldiers who participated in the Christmas truce reflected on what it meant to them. Their thoughts reveal complex, sometimes contradictory feelings about the experience. Many emphasize the basic humanity of the moment. Captain J.C. Dunn wrote, "For a few hours, we were allowed to be men rather than soldiers, to recognize the humanity in those we'd been taught to hate. It was extraordinary and deeply moving, and I shall remember it always." Others struggled with the contradiction between the truce and their duty. Lieutenant Bruce Bairnsfather, who later created famous cartoons about trench life, wrote, "I met a German officer on Christmas Day who was charming, educated, civilized. 2 days later, I was trying to kill him and he was trying to kill me. How does one reconcile this? I'm not sure it can be reconciled. War forces us into positions that defy logic and morality." Some soldiers regretted participating, feeling they had betrayed fallen comrades. Private William Tapp wrote, "I think of my mate Johnny, killed by German fire 3 weeks before Christmas. Would he have wanted me shaking hands with his killers? I don't think so. I wish I hadn't gone out there, hadn't participated. It felt good at the time, but now it just feels wrong." Others saw the truce as a proof that the war itself was wrong, that ordinary men on both sides wanted peace. Private Frank Richards, whose memoir Old Soldiers Never Die became a classic account of the war, reflected, "The Christmas truce showed that given a choice, soldiers would choose peace. We didn't want to be there, killing each other over mud. The war was kept going by politicians and generals who weren't doing the fighting. If it had been left to us, to the men in the trenches, we'd have ended it right there on Christmas Day 1914. For some, the truce became a touchstone, a memory they returned to again and again through the long, brutal years that followed. When the war dragged on through 1915, 1916, 1917, when the casualties mounted into the millions, when the Somme and Passchendaele turned the Western Front into an abattoir, veterans of the Christmas truce could remember one moment when humanity prevailed. Private Albert Morin, reflecting decades after the war, said, "I saw terrible things in the war, things I can't talk about, things that haunt my dreams. But I also saw something beautiful on Christmas 1914. I saw enemies become, briefly, friends. I saw men choose peace when they could have chosen war. That memory has sustained me through dark times. It reminds me that humans are capable of good, even in the worst circumstances." The aftermath, 1915 and beyond. As January 1915 arrived and the war entered its second year, military authorities on both sides took deliberate steps to ensure the Christmas truce could never be repeated. The most effective method was rotation. Units that had faced each other during the Christmas truce were moved to different sectors of the front. Fresh units, which hadn't experienced the fraternization and hadn't developed any sense of connection with the enemy opposite them, were rotated in. This rotation served multiple purposes. It prevented the development of the live and let live arrangements that had made the Christmas truce possible. It kept soldiers from becoming too familiar with the enemy. And it ensured that men who might have scruples about killing Germans they'd shared Christmas with were removed from that particular temptation. British General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, who had condemned the truce in the strongest terms, issued explicit orders. The artillery will maintain regular fire on enemy positions throughout Christmas Day and Boxing Day. Infantry units will conduct aggressive patrolling. Any officer who permits fraternization with the enemy will face court-martial. There will be no repeat of last year's disgraceful scene. The German High Command issued similar directives, particularly to Prussian units known for strict discipline. Officers were reminded that fraternization was treason, punishable by death. Men were told that any attempt to initiate contact with the enemy should be reported immediately. But beyond official orders, there was a more fundamental change. The war itself became more bitter, more brutal, more total. The experiences of 1915 and subsequent years made fraternization increasingly unthinkable. In April 1915, the Germans used poison gas for the first time at the Second Battle of Ypres. The yellow-green chlorine gas rolled across no man's land, choking and blinding Allied soldiers. Men drowned in their own fluids, their lungs destroyed by the chemical weapon. The use of poison gas, prohibited by international law, marked a new level of horror in the war. The British retaliated with their own gas attacks. Soon, both sides were regularly using poison gas, each new type more deadly than the last. Chlorine gave way to phosgene, then to mustard gas that burned skin and lungs, leaving men blind and scarred for life. It's hard to imagine Christmas truces in a war where both sides are using weapons designed to inflict maximum suffering, where international law is regularly violated, where the rules of civilized warfare have been abandoned. The massive offensives of 1915, 1916, and 1917 also made fraternization impossible. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day, 20,000 dead, in a failed offensive that gained virtually no ground. The battle continued for months, eventually producing over 1 million total casualties for minimal territorial gains. At Verdun in 1916, the French and Germans fought for 10 months over a strategically unimportant fortress, producing 700,000 casualties. The battle became a symbol of the war's senseless brutality, mountains of corpses for meaningless objectives. After such slaughter, hatred became real and deep. The men who survived the Somme or Verdun weren't inclined to see their enemies as fellow humans. They'd watched their friends blown apart, had waded through mud mixed with human remains, had experienced horror beyond description. The enemy who inflicted this horror wasn't someone you wanted to play football with. The nature of the soldiers themselves also changed. By 1916, most of the volunteers who had enthusiastically enlisted in 1914 were dead or invalided out. They were replaced by conscripts who hadn't chosen to join the army, who often resented being forced to fight, and who approached war with grim resignation rather than any romantic notions. These conscripts were also younger. As the war consumed men, the recruitment age kept dropping. Boys of 18, 17, even 16, lying about their age, found themselves in the trenches. These teenagers had been shaped by war, not by peacetime society. They knew nothing except conflict, and they accepted the enemy's dehumanization without the questioning that earlier soldiers might have had. Lieutenant Ernst Junger, a German officer who later wrote one of the most famous memoirs of the war, Storm of Steel, reflected on this transformation. By 1916, we were no longer the enthusiastic volunteers of 1914. We had become something else, specialists in violence, technicians of death. The war had made us hard, ruthless, efficient. There was no room for sentiment, no space for seeing the enemy as human. We were survivors, and survival meant killing without hesitation or remorse. Christmas 1915 and after Christmas 1915 came and went on the Western Front, with none of the fraternization of the previous year. Orders against any contact with the enemy were strictly enforced. Officers walked the trenches on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, ensuring men remained at their posts, that no singing carried across no man's land, that rifles stayed pointed at the enemy. In most sectors, Christmas 1915 was just another day of war. Artillery barrages continued, snipers maintained their deadly watch, Patrols ventured into no man's land under cover of darkness, seeking to kill or capture enemy soldiers. In a few isolated incidents, there were attempts at fraternization. In one sector, a German soldier began singing Stille Nacht on Christmas Eve, just as the previous year. But before British soldiers could respond, their officer ordered machine gun fire across no man's land. The singing stopped abruptly. The message was clear. There would be no repeat of 1914. Private Frank Richards, who had participated in the 1914 truce, was back in the trenches for Christmas 1915. We thought about the year before, about the singing and the football and the handshakes. Some of the lads who'd been there with us were dead now, killed in the fighting over the past year. It seemed like a dream, that Christmas truce, like something from another world. This year, we just kept our heads down and tried not to think too much about Christmas at home. For the soldiers who had experienced both Christmases, 1914 and 1915, the contrast was stark and depressing. The memory of the truce made the resumed warfare seem even more senseless. They had proven for one day that peace was possible, that enemies could be friends. And then they'd gone back to killing each other, not because they wanted to, but because orders demanded it. This realization that the war was sustained not by genuine hatred, but by institutional momentum, by orders from distant authorities, by political decisions made far from the trenches, was corrosive to morale. Some soldiers became cynical, doing only the minimum required, looking for ways to survive rather than ways to win. Others became reckless, taking unnecessary risks, perhaps subconsciously seeking death as an escape from the moral contradiction of killing men they didn't truly hate. Christmas 1916, 1917, and 1918 saw no truces. By then, too much blood had been spilled, too much horror endured. The Christmas Truce of 1914 became a distant memory, something old-timers talked about occasionally, but younger soldiers found impossible to believe. "You're telling me you played football with the Germans? You're having me on," was a common response from soldiers who joined later in the war. The story seemed fantastical, impossible. In the war they knew, the war of gas attacks and machine gun barrages, of men drowning in mud and bodies left to rot because they couldn't be retrieved. The idea of fraternizing with the enemy was literally unthinkable. The war ends. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. The armistice, not yet a peace treaty, but a ceasefire, took effect. The war was over. In some sectors, the final hours before the armistice saw frantic fighting as commanders ordered attacks to achieve last-minute objectives or to inflate casualty figures. Men died in the final minutes of the war, killed in actions that would be forgotten within days, their deaths meaningless because everyone knew the war was ending. In other sectors, soldiers on both sides simply stopped fighting when they realized the end was coming. Why risk death in the last hours when peace was imminent? When 11 a.m. arrived and the firing stopped, the silence was almost overwhelming. Men who had lived with constant noise, artillery, rifles, machine guns, explosions, for years suddenly experienced quiet. Some stood up cautiously, unable to believe they could do so without being shot. Others wept, overcome with relief and grief for all who hadn't survived to see this moment. There was no spontaneous fraternization like in December 1914. The two sides remained in their trenches, wary, not yet trusting the peace. The hatred and bitterness of 4 years of war couldn't be dissolved instantly by a ceasefire announcement. But gradually, over the following days, as it became clear the war was truly over, men emerged from the trenches. Some met in no man's land, shaking hands, exchanging cigarettes, showing photographs of family members who had survived or been killed. But it was different from 1914, sadder, weighted with 4 years of trauma and loss. The Western Front, which had been a scar across Europe for 4 years, slowly emptied. Soldiers went home, those who had survived. The trenches, which had been homes to millions of men, were gradually filled in or left to decay. No man's land, contested for years at the cost of millions of lives, returned to nature. Farmers would later work this ground, their plows regularly turning up skulls and bones and unexploded ordnance that remains dangerous to this day. The final accounting of the war was staggering. Approximately 10 million soldiers dead, 21 million wounded, many maimed for life, countless civilians killed by war, disease, and famine. An entire generation of young European men decimated, empires destroyed, the political map of Europe redrawn. And for what? Historians still debate the war's causes and whether anything was truly accomplished. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, created conditions that would lead directly to World War II 20 years later. The war to end all wars had merely set the stage for an even more devastating conflict. The veterans remember. For the men who survived the war and returned home, the Christmas Truce became a touchstone memory, something they turned over in their minds for the rest of their lives, trying to understand what it meant. Many veterans spoke about the truce in later years, giving interviews, writing memoirs, sharing their stories with historians. Their accounts reveal how the memory evolved and what it came to represent. Private Albert Morin, who had been just 17 during the Christmas Truce, lived until 1982. In his later years, he gave several interviews about his experiences. The Christmas Truce was the most extraordinary thing I experienced in the entire war, he said in a 1981 interview. Not the battles, not the fear, not the horror, extraordinary in a different way. It showed me that humans have a capacity for goodness that can emerge even in the worst circumstances. I've thought about it almost every Christmas for 67 years. I think about that German soldier I talked to, wonder if he survived, wonder if he remembered that day too. Lieutenant Bruce Bairnsfather, who became famous after the war for his cartoons depicting trench life, often referenced the Christmas Truce in his work and writings. He saw it as representative of the ordinary soldier's experience, caught between official duties and personal humanity, forced to fight but longing for peace. In his memoir published in 1916, while the war still raged, Bairnsfather wrote, "The Christmas Truce of 1914 will always stand out in my memory as one of the most curious events in the history of warfare. Here were two armies that had been locked in deadly combat for months, suddenly putting aside their weapons to celebrate Christmas together. It was spontaneous, unauthorized, and utterly human. Military historians will analyze it, and generals will condemn it. But for those of us who were there, it was simply a moment when sanity briefly prevailed." Not all veterans viewed the truce positively. Some, particularly those who had lost brothers or close friends in the war, saw it as a betrayal. Captain Edward Rowe, who lost his younger brother at the Somme in 1916, wrote bitterly, "The men who fraternized with the Germans on Christmas 1914 forgot what we were fighting for. They forgot the Germans had invaded Belgium, had committed atrocities, had started this war. That moment of sentiment probably cost lives later, made men hesitate when they should have fired. I have no sympathy for it." This view was minority among veterans, but it existed. The Christmas Truce became, for some, a symbol of weakness, of soldiers who didn't hate enough, didn't have the proper fighting spirit. This interpretation was particularly common among officers who hadn't personally experienced trench warfare, who maintained throughout their lives that war required absolute hatred of the enemy, and that any fraternization was dangerous sentimentality. The truce in popular memory. As the years passed and World War I veterans aged and died, the Christmas Truce took on mythological status. It became, in popular memory, a symbol of humanity's capacity for peace, a beacon of light in the darkness of war. The story was told and retold, often with embellishments. The football match, which had been several informal kickabouts in different sectors, became in some retellings a formal match with uniforms and goals and referees. The fraternization, which had been limited to certain sectors and involved perhaps thousands of soldiers, was sometimes portrayed as universal across the entire Western Front. These embellishments, while historically inaccurate, served a purpose. The Christmas Truce became a parable, a story about the possibility of peace even in the midst of war, about the fundamental decency of ordinary people when freed from the demands of authority. Writers, poets, and artists drew on the Christmas Truce as inspiration. It appeared in poems, novels, plays, and films. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: the singing, the football, the shared humanity, the poignancy of peace being temporary. One of the most famous artistic representations came in 1969 with the folk song Christmas in the Trenches by John McCutcheon. The song, told from the perspective of a British soldier, captured the emotional heart of the story. "My name is Francis Tolliver. I come from Liverpool 2 years ago. The war was waiting for me after school, to Belgium and to Flanders, to Germany, to here. I fought for king and country. I loved dear. 'Twas Christmas in the trenches, where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were still. No Christmas song was sung. Our families back in England were toasting us that day. They're brave and glorious lads so far away." The song became popular in folk music circles and introduced the Christmas Truce story to new generations who hadn't known about it. While not entirely historically accurate, it portrayed a single soldier's experience rather than the complex, varied reality. It captured the emotional truth of the event. In 2005, a French film, Joyeux Noël, Merry Christmas, dramatized the Christmas Truce, focusing on French, German, and Scottish soldiers who fraternize on Christmas 1914. The film took creative liberties with history but was praised for capturing the spirit of the event and introducing it to audiences worldwide. The Christmas Truce also became a regular feature of Christmas programming on British television and radio, with documentaries, dramatizations, and interviews with the few remaining veterans appearing annually. Schools taught it as part of World War I curriculum, often as an example of peace education. Historical debates. Historians have long debated the significance and meaning of the Christmas Truce. Was it a genuine peace movement from below, soldiers rejecting the war? Or was it merely a temporary pause, a brief respite that changed nothing? Some historians, particularly those writing in the 1960s and 1970s during the Vietnam War era, emphasized the Christmas Truce as an anti-war event. They argued it demonstrated that ordinary soldiers didn't want to fight, that the war was sustained by governments and generals against the will of those actually doing the fighting. In this interpretation, the Christmas Truce was a missed opportunity. If the soldiers had refused to resume fighting, the war might have ended in 1914, saving millions of lives. This view was challenged by other historians who argued it was anachronistic to project modern anti-war sentiments onto 1914 soldiers. Most participants in the Christmas Truce remained committed to winning the war. They didn't fraternize because they opposed the war, but because Christmas created a specific context that temporarily suspended hostilities. When Christmas ended, they returned to fighting because they still believed in their cause. Professor Malcolm Brown, who wrote extensively about the Christmas Truce, argued, "We must be careful not to romanticize or oversimplify the Christmas Truce. It wasn't a peace movement. It wasn't soldiers rejecting the war. It was a very specific, culturally bound response to a particular moment. The same soldiers who sang carols with Germans on Christmas Day were shooting at them on December 27th. This doesn't diminish the truce's significance, but we must understand it in its proper context." Other historians have focused on what the Christmas Truce reveals about the nature of early 20th century warfare and soldier psychology. The fact that such fraternization was possible in 1914, but unthinkable by 1916, demonstrates how the war itself changed men, how the brutality of industrial warfare destroyed the possibility of seeing enemies as human. Dr. Stanley Weintraub, in his book Silent Night, The Story of the World War I Christmas Truce, argues, the Christmas Truce was only possible because the war was still young enough that soldiers retained their pre-war humanity. They could still see enemies as people like themselves. By 1916, after the Somme and Verdun, after poison gas and mass slaughter, that capacity for empathy had been largely destroyed. The Christmas Truce represents the last moment of innocence in World War I, the last time soldiers could choose humanity over duty. There has also been debate about whether the Christmas Truce should be celebrated or condemned. Some argue that celebrating it romanticizes war, suggesting that conflict can be paused for sentiment, then resumed without consequence. Others counter that it provides a necessary reminder of humanity's capacity for peace, a beacon of hope that should be remembered and honored. The last survivors. As the 20th century progressed, the number of World War I veterans steadily declined. By the 1980s, they were all in their 80s or 90s. By the 2000s, only a handful remained. The last known British veteran of World War I, Harry Patch, died in 2009 at the age of 111. Patch had fought at Passchendaele in 1917 and carried traumatic memories of the war throughout his long life. He hadn't participated in the Christmas Truce. He wasn't at the front in 1914, but he was aware of its significance. In his later years, Patch became an advocate for peace and reconciliation. He met with German veterans, shook hands with former enemies, and spoke about the futility of war. "War is organized murder and nothing else," he said in a 2008 interview. The Christmas Truce shows that even in the midst of organized murder, humanity can break through. I wish it had lasted longer. I wish the soldiers had refused to go back to fighting. Maybe if they had, I wouldn't have had to experience Passchendaele. The last known German veteran of World War I, Erich Kästner, died in 2008 at the age of 107. Kästner had been at the front in 1918, late in the war, and like Patch, hadn't experienced the Christmas Truce personally, but he knew its story and understood its importance. "The Christmas Truce is important to remember," Kästner said in a 2006 interview, "because it shows that even in the worst circumstances, peace is possible if people choose it. The problem is that people don't usually get to choose. We are ordered to fight by those who aren't doing the fighting themselves. The soldiers in 1914 chose peace, briefly, and that choice should be honored." With the deaths of the last veterans, the Christmas Truce passed from living memory into history. There were no longer any eyewitnesses, no one who could say, "I was there, this is what happened." The event became entirely dependent on the letters, diaries, photographs, and recorded interviews left behind. This transition from memory to history is always significant. Living witnesses can correct misunderstandings, can add nuance and detail that written records miss, can convey the emotional reality of events in ways documents cannot. Without them, events can be simplified, romanticized, or misunderstood. Historians and educators working to preserve the accurate history of the Christmas Truce have emphasized the importance of primary sources, the letters soldiers wrote home, the diary entries made at the time, the official reports, however disapproving, filed by officers. These documents provide the raw material for understanding what actually happened as opposed to what later generations might wish had happened. The Christmas Truce today. More than a century after the events of December 1914, the Christmas Truce continues to resonate in popular culture and historical memory. It appears in Christmas programming, in educational curricula, in peace education initiatives, and in commemorations of World War I. In Britain, the Christmas Truce has become an established part of World War I remembrance. The Imperial War Museum in London maintains exhibits about it, including letters, photographs, and artifacts from participants. Schools teach it as part of history lessons about the war, often emphasizing themes of peace, humanity, and the tragedy of war. The site near Ploegstert, Belgium, where much of the fraternization occurred, has become a pilgrimage destination. A memorial stone marks the approximate location of the Christmas Truce, and visitors regularly leave poppies, crosses, and footballs as tributes. Each Christmas, ceremonies are held at various Western Front memorials to commemorate the truce. Veterans organizations, peace groups, and local communities gather to sing carols, share readings from soldiers' letters, and reflect on the meaning of that extraordinary moment. The Christmas Truce has also been invoked in various peace and reconciliation efforts. The symbolism of enemies becoming friends, even temporarily, resonates with people working to end conflicts and build bridges between hostile groups. In 1999, the Christmas Truce was commemorated by a football match between British and German military teams at the site where the original matches had been played. The game ended in a 1-1 draw, considered appropriately symbolic. In 2014, The centenary of the Christmas Truce was marked by extensive commemorations. A documentary featuring the last recorded interviews with veterans who had participated aired on British television. Artists created new works inspired by the event. And at Plugstert, thousands gathered for a ceremony that included carol singing in English and German, echoing the events of a century before. Perhaps the most visible centenary commemoration was a British Christmas advertisement by the supermarket chain Sainsbury's. The advertisement, titled "Christmas is for Sharing," depicted the Christmas Truce, showing British and German soldiers meeting in no man's land, sharing chocolate, and playing football. The ad was controversial. Some praised it as a moving tribute, others criticized it as commercializing a sacred moment, but it introduced the Christmas Truce story to millions who might not have known about it. What the Christmas Truce means. So what does the Christmas Truce mean more than a century later? Why does this brief moment of peace in the midst of a catastrophic war continue to fascinate and inspire? At its most fundamental level, the Christmas Truce represents the tension between individual humanity and institutional authority. The soldiers who participated were not rebelling against the war or refusing their duty. They were simply asserting their humanity for a brief moment, claiming the right to see their enemies as fellow humans rather than targets to be killed. This assertion was, in its own way, deeply subversive. War requires dehumanization of the enemy. Soldiers must be trained to see enemies as others, as threats, as abstractions, as legitimate targets. The moment you recognize the enemy as a human being like yourself, with family, hopes, fears, and the same desire to survive and return home, killing becomes much more difficult. The Christmas Truce, by breaking down that dehumanization, challenged the fundamental logic of war. The men who shook hands with Germans on Christmas Day could never quite forget that their enemies were human. This memory might make them more hesitant to kill, might introduce doubt and moral complexity into acts that military efficiency requires to be simple and automatic. This is why military authorities reacted so strongly to the truce, why they worked so hard to prevent any repeat. The Christmas Truce wasn't dangerous because it stopped the fighting for a day or two. That was merely inconvenient. It was dangerous because it made soldiers think, made them question, made them see the contradictions inherent in modern warfare. The Christmas Truce also represents the power of culture and tradition. Christmas, with its emphasis on peace, goodwill, family, and faith, created a framework that temporarily superseded military duty. The cultural imperative to celebrate Christmas in a particular way, with singing, with gathering together, with expressing goodwill, was strong enough to overcome months of military training and indoctrination. This suggests that cultural values can, under certain circumstances, override institutional demands. The soldiers chose Christmas traditions over military orders, chose cultural identity over national identity, chose to be Christians, or simply humans celebrating a cultural holiday, rather than British or German soldiers. For peace educators and activists, the Christmas Truce has become a powerful example of the possibility of peace, even in the most unlikely circumstances. If soldiers in the trenches of World War I could find common ground and choose peace, however temporarily, then surely people in less extreme circumstances can find ways to resolve conflicts peacefully. This interpretation, while inspiring, must be tempered with historical reality. The Christmas Truce didn't end the war. It didn't prevent the slaughter that continued for 4 more years. The men who sang carols together on Christmas 1914 went back to killing each other, and many of them died in the process. The truce was beautiful, but ultimately futile, a brief candle in a darkness that continued for years. Yet the futility doesn't negate the importance. Perhaps the Christmas Truce matters precisely because it was temporary, because it showed that even knowing peace was possible and enemies were human, the war continued. This reveals something profound about the nature of war, that it's sustained not by individual hatred, but by institutional momentum, by orders and duty, and the inability of individuals to stop the machine once it's in motion. Personal stories. Preserved, among the most moving aspects of the Christmas Truce, are the personal stories that have been preserved through letters and diaries. These individual accounts bring the event to life in ways that broader historical narratives cannot. Lieutenant Cyril Drummond of the Royal Field Artillery, though initially skeptical of fraternization, eventually participated and wrote extensively about his experience. I met a German officer named Hartmann who had studied in Cambridge before the war. We discovered we had mutual acquaintances, had attended some of the same lectures, had drunk in some of the same pubs. It was surreal. Here we were, in the middle of a war, discussing Cambridge as if we'd met at a reunion. He showed me a photograph of his wife and infant daughter. I showed him a photograph of my fiancée. We talked about what we'd do after the war, made plans to meet in Cambridge once it was over. 3 months later, I learned he'd been killed at Neuve-Chapelle. I've kept his photograph all these years. His daughter, if she survived the war, would be in her 50s now. I wonder sometimes if she knows her father spent Christmas 1914 talking about Cambridge with an English officer. Private Frederick Heath of the Northumberland Fusiliers kept a detailed diary throughout the war. His entry for December 25, 1914, is one of the most vivid accounts of the truce. Today has been the most extraordinary day of my life. This morning, I woke up expecting just another day of war, of cold and fear and the possibility of death. Instead, I spent the afternoon playing football in no man's land with German soldiers, the same men who've been trying to kill me for months. We laughed together, shared cigarettes, showed each other photographs of our families. For a few hours, the war didn't exist. We were just young men, far from home, making the best of a terrible situation. Tomorrow, we'll go back to being enemies, back to trying to kill each other. But today, we were friends. I don't understand how both things can be true, but they are. Captain Robert Hamilton of the Scots Guards wrote to his wife about an encounter that stayed with him. I met a young German soldier, couldn't have been more than 18, who reminded me terribly of our nephew James. Same age, same earnest expression, same enthusiasm despite the awful circumstances. He spoke a bit of English and told me about his family's bakery in Munich, about how he hoped to take over the business after the war, about the girl he wanted to marry. I listened and thought about James, about all the young men on both sides who have similar dreams, similar hopes, and I wondered how many of them will survive to fulfill those dreams. I fear the answer is not many. These personal stories, preserved through the century, remind us that the Christmas Truce wasn't an abstract historical event. It was a concrete experience for thousands of individual men, each with their own perspective, their own emotions, their own understanding of what it meant. The unanswered questions. Despite extensive historical research, some questions about the Christmas Truce remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. How widespread was it really? Estimates vary wildly. Some historians suggest it occurred across 2/3 of the British line. Others argue it was much more limited, perhaps 1/3 or less. German records are incomplete and French records are sparse. We'll never know exactly how many soldiers participated or how many sectors experienced fraternization. Why did it happen in some sectors but not others? The conventional explanation that Saxon and Bavarian units were more willing to fraternize than Prussian units is partially true, but doesn't explain all variations. Some Prussian sectors saw truces, some Saxon sectors didn't. Local conditions, recent casualties, personalities of officers, and pure chance all played roles that are difficult to reconstruct a century later. What were the long-term psychological effects on participants? Did men who fraternized with the enemy have more difficulty killing later? Did they experience more moral injury, more guilt, more post-traumatic stress? We have some individual accounts suggesting this, but no systematic data. The psychological impact remains largely unknown. Could the Christmas truce have spread to end the war? This counterfactual is often debated. If authorities hadn't cracked down, if the truce had continued beyond Christmas, if it had spread to French and German sectors, could the soldiers have simply refused to fight and forced their governments to negotiate peace? Most historians are skeptical. While individual soldiers might have embraced peace, the institutional mechanisms of war, military discipline, nationalism, propaganda, economic interests were too powerful to be overcome by spontaneous fraternization. The soldiers were not revolutionaries. They were ordinary men who took advantage of a unique moment but remained fundamentally obedient to authority. Yet we can't know for certain. History is full of moments when small events cascaded into large changes. Perhaps if the Christmas truce had been allowed to continue, if it had spread rather than being suppressed, something different might have emerged. We'll never know, but the question remains tantalizing. Lessons for today. What can the Christmas truce teach us today, more than a century later, in a world still plagued by conflicts and wars? First, it reminds us that enemies are human beings. In modern conflicts, especially those involving terrorism or ideological extremism, dehumanization of the enemy is common and often deliberate. The Christmas truce shows that even in the midst of a brutal war, soldiers could recognize their enemy's humanity. This recognition didn't end the conflict, but it introduced moral complexity that is important to maintain. Second, it demonstrates the power of cultural traditions to create common ground. Christmas provided a shared framework that transcended national boundaries. In today's conflicts, finding similar shared cultural or religious frameworks might create opportunities for dialogue and understanding, even if not peace. Third, it illustrates the limitations of top-down authority. The Christmas truce happened despite orders against it, driven by soldiers' own choices. This suggests that peace, when it comes, often emerges from below rather than being imposed from above. Diplomats and politicians may negotiate treaties, but lasting peace requires ordinary people to choose peaceful coexistence. Fourth, it shows that peace is possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. If soldiers in the trenches of World War I could find common ground, then surely people in less extreme circumstances can do the same. The Christmas truce is a reminder that no conflict is so intractable that moments of humanity cannot break through. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Christmas truce reminds us that peace is a choice that must be actively maintained. The truce ended not because the soldiers wanted to resume fighting, but because institutional pressures forced them back into war. This suggests that peace requires constant effort, constant choice, constant resistance to forces that would prefer conflict. Remembering the truce. As we remember the Christmas truce of 1914, we honor the men who participated in it, British, German, and in some sectors, French and Belgian. These men, caught in a war they hadn't started and couldn't end, found it in themselves to recognize their enemy's humanity and choose, however briefly, peace over violence. We remember Private Albert Morin, who at 17 shared cigarettes with a German carpenter and carried that memory for 68 years. We remember Lieutenant Johannes Niemann, who organized the singing of Stille Nacht and watched with wonder as British soldiers responded with their own carols. We remember Captain Sir Edward Hooles, who climbed out of his trench to meet German officers and found civilized men rather than barbaric enemies. We remember the thousands whose names we don't know, who climbed out of the trenches on Christmas Day 1914 and chose humanity over hatred, peace over violence, hope over despair. Many of these men died in the years that followed. The Somme claimed them, or Passchendaele, or any of the dozens of smaller battles that ground through millions of lives. They never got to go home, never got to fulfill the dreams they'd discussed in no man's land on Christmas 1914. But for one day, one extraordinary day, they had peace. They sang carols with enemies. They played football in a wasteland. They saw each other as human beings rather than targets. And in that moment, however brief and however ultimately futile, they created something beautiful and true and worth remembering. The enduring symbol. The Christmas truce of 1914 has become more than a historical event. It has become a symbol, a parable, a story we tell ourselves about who we are and who we might be. It symbolizes the possibility of peace even in the darkest circumstances. It represents humanity's capacity for compassion and connection even when institutional forces demand violence and separation. It demonstrates that ordinary people, given the choice, often choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over hatred, peace over war. The truce also symbolizes the tragedy of war, that after experiencing this moment of peace, after recognizing their enemy's humanity, the soldiers went back to killing each other. They did so not because they wanted to, but because systems and institutions and orders demanded it. This reveals the fundamental tragedy of war. It's often sustained not by individual hatred, but by collective momentum that no individual can stop. Every Christmas, when we remember the truce, we're reminded of both the possibility and the fragility of peace. We're reminded that peace requires active choice, constant effort, resistance to forces that would prefer conflict. We're reminded that seeing our enemies as human beings is the first step toward ending conflict, but not the last. The men who participated in the Christmas truce have all passed now. The last eyewitnesses are gone. The trenches have been filled in, the battlefields returned to farmland. But the memory endures, passed down through generations, preserved in letters and diaries and photographs, kept alive through stories and songs and commemorations. As long as we remember the Christmas truce, as long as we tell its story and reflect on its meaning, those men, British, German, French, Belgian, who chose peace on Christmas 1914, have not died in vain. Their choice, however temporary, however ultimately futile in ending the war, reminds us that peace is always possible, always within reach, if only we have the courage to choose it. On Christmas Eve 1914, in the frozen trenches of Belgium and France, men began to sing. The song was Silent Night, sung first in German, then in English, the two languages blending in the cold night air. The song spoke of peace, of hope, of light in darkness. For one brief, beautiful moment, the song was true. The night was silent. Peace reigned. Hope lived. And more than a century later, we remember, and in remembering, we honor those men who showed us that even in the midst of war, humanity endures. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, for one day it was.